My name is Michael Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and until 3 months ago, I believed my brother was a good man who had just married a difficult woman. I was wrong on both counts, but it took a phone call at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night to show me exactly how wrong. I was in Cincinnati, 4 hours from the house I grew up in, sitting at my kitchen table finishing up some work emails, when my phone lit up with my mother's name. She never called that late. My mother is the kind of woman who goes to bed at 9 and wakes up at 5, who has followed the same routine for as long as I can remember. So when I saw her name on the screen at 11, my stomach dropped before I even answered. "Mom? Is Dad okay?" There was a silence, and then I heard her crying. Not the soft, controlled crying she did at funerals, holding it together for everyone else. This was different. This was raw. "Michael," she said, her voice breaking, "I don't know what to do." I sat up straight. "Mom, talk to me. What happened?" It took her almost 5 minutes to get the story out between sobs, and when she finally did, I felt something cold settle into my chest, a feeling I hadn't had since I was a kid, and realized for the first time that adults could be cruel too. Vanessa, my brother, Danny's wife of 6 years, had sat my parents down at the kitchen table that evening. The same table where I'd eaten cereal every morning for 18 years, where my father taught me how to do long division, where my mother rolled out dough for Thanksgiving pies every November without fail. Vanessa sat my parents down at that table and told them, in plain and deliberate language, that if they wanted to continue living in the house, they would need to sign over their retirement savings, roughly $340,000, into an account that she and Danny controlled. She said we weren't contributing, my mother told me. She said Danny was paying the mortgage and it wasn't fair that we lived here for free. I had to stop her right there. "Mom, there is no mortgage. You guys paid that house off 11 years ago." "I know that," my mother said. "But your father, he doesn't always remember that anymore." And when she said it, he just nodded along like it made sense. That detail broke something in me. My father, Robert Bennett, had been a machinist for 31 years before he retired. He built the shed in the backyard with his own hands. He taught me how to change oil, how to throw a punch, how to shake a man's hand like I meant it. 2 years ago, he started forgetting things. Small things at first, where he put his keys, what day it was. Then bigger things. 6 months ago, a neurologist gave us the words we'd all been dreading. Early-stage vascular dementia, likely to progress. And Vanessa knew all of this. She had sat in the living room during the appointment where the doctor explained it to us. She had hugged my mother afterward and said, "Whatever you guys need, we're here for you." Apparently what she meant was, "We're here for you, as long as you're worth $340,000 to us." To understand how a woman could look her elderly, memory-impaired father-in-law in the eye and demand his life savings, you have to understand how the house ended up in my brother's name in the first place. My parents bought that house in 1988, a modest 3-bedroom on 2 acres outside Columbus, Ohio. They paid it off in 2013, the same year I graduated college. It was the one truly stable thing in our family's life. The address that never changed, the porch light that was always on, the driveway where my dad taught both of us to drive. 2 years ago, right around the time my father's memory problems started becoming noticeable, my brother Danny came to them with a proposal. He was working in insurance at the time. He'd since moved into a mortgage brokerage job, and he had, in his words, seen too many families lose everything to medical bills and lawsuits. He suggested that our parents transfer the deed of the house into his name, for protection. His argument was that if anything happened, a lawsuit, a medical bankruptcy, a nursing home spend-down, the house would be safe from creditors if it wasn't legally theirs anymore. He framed it as an act of love, a son protecting his aging parents. My parents, who trusted Danny completely because he was the one who stayed local while I moved away for a job in tech consulting, signed the paperwork without hesitation. There was a verbal agreement, nothing in writing, because we're family. We don't need lawyers for this. That they would live in the house for the rest of their lives, rent-free, no matter what. I want to be honest about something. When my mother told me about this transfer 2 years ago, I had a bad feeling about it. I remember asking her, "Did you get anything in writing, even just a simple letter?" And she said, "Michael, it's your brother. We don't need a contract with our own son." I let it go. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Danny might not be perfect, but he wasn't the kind of person who would ever hurt our parents. I was wrong. Or maybe I wasn't wrong about Danny. Exactly, Danny wasn't the one who orchestrated the ultimatum. It was Vanessa. But Danny was the one who let it happen, who stood next to her at that kitchen table and said nothing, while his wife threatened to put his parents out on the street. That's a betrayal too. Maybe a quieter one, but a betrayal all the same. I need to talk about Vanessa, because for years, I gave her the benefit of the doubt in a way I now regret. Danny met Vanessa when he was 26, at a mutual friend's wedding. She was charming in the way that certain people are charming quick, with a compliment, generous with her attention, the kind of woman who remembers your birthday and sends a card. My mother liked her immediately. My father liked her too, in his quieter way, mostly because she made an effort to ask him about his old job at the machine shop, a subject most people found boring within 30 seconds. But there were signs, if I'm honest with myself now, looking back. At their wedding, which my parents paid for almost entirely $62,000, I remember because my dad joked about it for years afterward. Vanessa insisted on changes that pushed the budget higher and higher, and when my mother gently suggested scaling back the flowers, Vanessa cried in front of the wedding planner and said my mother didn't want her to have a real wedding. My mother, who has spent her whole life avoiding conflict, apologized and paid for the flowers. 3 years into the marriage, Danny wanted to start his own insurance brokerage. He needed startup capital, about $45,000. My parents co-signed a loan for him, using their own credit as collateral, something that could have devastated their finances if the business failed. The business did fail. 18 months later, my parents never once asked for that money back, never mentioned it at holidays, never made Danny feel guilty about it. They absorbed the loss quietly, the way they absorbed most things involving my brother. I bring this up because it matters for what comes later. My parents had already given my brother and his wife tens of thousands of dollars over the years, freely, without complaint, without expecting anything in return. And it still wasn't enough. Vanessa still sat them down at that kitchen table and told them to hand over everything else too. There were smaller signs as well, moments my mother mentioned to me over the years that I brushed off as harmless jokes. Vanessa commenting, more than once, "This is a lot of house for just the two of you. Danny and I could really use the space." Vanessa reorganizing my mother's kitchen cabinets during a visit to make it more efficient, without asking. Vanessa telling my mother, during a discussion about wills, that it only makes sense for Danny to get the house, since he's local, and I do so much for you both. At the time, my mother laughed these comments off as Vanessa being Vanessa, a little pushy, a little tone-deaf, but not malicious. I think now that my mother, like a lot of people who avoid conflict, chose not to see the pattern because seeing it would have meant confronting it, and confronting it would have meant risking the relationship with her son. I didn't call ahead. I've thought about that decision a lot since, whether it was the right one, and I still believe it was. If I had called, Vanessa would have had time to control the narrative, to soften what had happened, to have an explanation ready. I wanted to see the situation with my own eyes. I left Cincinnati at 6 the next morning and got to my parents' house by 10. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Vanessa's car already there, which told me she'd come back the very next day to keep the pressure on. I walked in without knocking pressed. I still had a key. I'd had one since I was 16, and found Vanessa sitting at the kitchen table with a manila folder open in front of her, going through what looked like my mother's address book and some financial papers. She looked up at me with an expression that flickered, just for a second, between surprise and irritation, before she rearranged it into a smile. "Michael, we didn't know you were coming." "Clearly," I said. My father was in his recliner in the living room, the television on low, a mug of coffee on the side table that had gone cold, I could tell, because there was a thin film on the surface, and my dad never let his coffee sit that long, not even now with his memory the way it was. He looked up at me and smiled, genuinely happy to see me, but there was something dazed in his expression, like he'd been sitting there a while without anyone really talking to him. "Hey, Dad. Michael, good to see you, son." He started to get up to hug me, and I went to him instead so he wouldn't have to struggle out of the recliner. I found my mother in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, and the moment she saw me, she started crying again. I sat next to her and let her get it out before I asked her to walk me through everything, slowly, from the beginning. She told me about the folder Vanessa had brought over transfer paperwork for a joint account, already partially filled out with my parents' names, waiting only for signatures. She told me Vanessa had used the word fair over and over. Fair that Danny and Vanessa should benefit from a house they were paying for. Fair that my parents contribute something. After years of freeloading, my mother used that exact word, freeloading, and hearing it come out of her mouth, describing herself and my father, made my hands curl into fists under the table. She told me that when she pushed back, gently, saying she needed to think about it, Vanessa had said, "Well, think about it fast, because Danny and I can't keep covering everything forever. If you can't contribute, we'll have to consider other arrangements for the house." The implication was clear, even if the words stopped short of an outright threat. "Sign over the money, or we find a way to make you leave." I asked my mother if Danny had said anything during this conversation. She said he'd mostly stayed quiet, occasionally nodding along with Vanessa, and at one point saying, "It's only fair, Mom. You guys need to start pulling your weight." Pulling your weight. My 71-year-old father, a man who worked in a machine shop for 3 decades, who came home every day smelling like metal shavings and machine oil, who never missed a single one of my Little League games, even when he'd been on his feet for 10 hours. That man was being told by his own son that he needed to pull his weight. I went back out to the kitchen where Vanessa was still sitting, still pretending to organize papers that didn't need organizing. I sat down across from her, and I made a decision in that moment that I've stuck to throughout this entire ordeal. I would not yell. I would not give her the satisfaction of making this about my anger instead of her behavior. People like Vanessa are skilled at flipping a script, at turning, "You threaten my parents," into, "You're the one causing a scene." I wasn't going to hand her that opportunity. "I want to see the paperwork," I said. She hesitated, then slid the folder across the table. It was exactly what my mother described a joint account application with my parents' names, and a separate document that, reading closely, functioned essentially as a transfer authorization for their retirement funds into that joint account. I photographed every page with my phone. "Can you explain to me," I said, keeping my voice level, "why you told my parents they need to hand over their retirement savings or find somewhere else to live?" "That's not what happened," Vanessa said. "We had a conversation about fairness. Nobody threatened anyone." My mother used the word threatened. She's sitting in the other room right now, crying, because your conversation about fairness left her thinking she and Dad are about to be homeless. She's being dramatic. This house needs money put into it. The roof needs work. Danny and I have been covering costs for years and getting nothing in return. "There's no mortgage on this house," I said. "There hasn't been one in 11 years. What costs exactly are you covering?" She didn't have an immediate answer for that. She shifted in her seat and said something about property taxes and maintenance, numbers that didn't remotely approach the $340,000 she'd asked for. I called Danny into the kitchen. He'd been in the garage, conveniently absent during all of this. When he came in, I asked him directly, in front of Vanessa, whether he was aware his wife had asked their parents, one of whom has a documented cognitive impairment, to sign over their life savings under threat of losing their home. He said, "It wasn't a threat. It was just a conversation about fairness." I asked him to repeat that sentence out loud, slowly, so he could hear what he actually sounded like. He didn't repeat it. He looked at the floor instead. "I want to be fair here, because this story isn't really about hatred. It's about clarity. I don't think Danny is a monster. I think Danny is a man who has spent years letting his wife make decisions for him, who has avoided conflict with her the same way our mother avoids conflict, and who found it easier to go along with something he knew was wrong than to stand up to the person he lives with every day. That's not an excuse, it's an explanation, and there's a difference. He still bears responsibility for standing in that kitchen and doing nothing while his parents were threatened." That night, after Vanessa and Danny left, Vanessa insisting on the way out that this wasn't over and that they would need to revisit this conversation soon, I sat down with my parents at the kitchen table. I asked them directly, did they want to stay in that house, under those terms, with that pressure hanging over them, or did they want out? My mother didn't hesitate. "I can't sleep in this house anymore," she said, knowing what she thinks of us, knowing that she looked at your father, knowing what's happening to his mind, and saw an opportunity. My father was having one of his clearer moments. Dementia isn't a steady decline. It comes in waves, good days and bad days, and he said something I will never forget as long as I live. He said, "I built the shed out back with my own 2 hands, the year your brother was born. I never thought I'd have to buy it back from him. I made a decision that night. I told my parents I was going to help them, whatever it took, and that they were not going to sign anything, not going to hand over a single dollar, and not going to be pressured out of the home they'd lived in for 38 years. The next morning, I called an elder law attorney. Her name was Patricia Osei, and she specialized in exactly this kind of situation: financial exploitation of elderly and cognitively impaired individuals, often by family members. When I explained the situation, she didn't sound surprised. She told me this pattern was far more common than most people realized, and that adult children or their spouses coercing elderly parents out of assets was one of the most underreported forms of elder abuse in the country, partly because families are ashamed to report family. She explained something that terrified me, because the house had already been legally transferred into Danny's name 2 years earlier. With no written agreement guaranteeing my parents' right to remain there, they had no automatic legal protection. If Danny and Vanessa decided to sell the house or evict them, My parents would have very limited recourse unless we could prove that the original transfer had been the product of undue influence, particularly given my father's cognitive state. That word, undue influence, became the center of everything that followed. Patricia explained that undue influence cases hinge on a few key factors: whether the person who transferred the asset had diminished capacity at the time, whether there was a relationship of trust that was exploited, and whether the transfer benefited the person exerting influence at the expense of the vulnerable party. We had more evidence than I initially realized. My father's neurologist had documented cognitive decline beginning approximately 8 months before the house transfer, meaning his early symptoms, the ones that would eventually be diagnosed as vascular dementia, were already present, even if undiagnosed, when he signed away the deed. Patricia explained that early-stage cognitive impairment doesn't need to be formally diagnosed at the time of a transfer to be legally relevant. Medical records showing a documented decline trajectory could establish that his capacity to fully understand complex financial and legal transactions was already compromised. We gathered my father's medical records. We gathered notes from a family friend, a retired nurse named Carol, who had noticed my father's confusion at a 4th of July barbecue nearly a year before the transfer, and had mentioned it to my mother at the time. That conversation, thankfully, my mother remembered well enough to date approximately, and Carol was willing to provide a written statement confirming it. And then there was the evidence Vanessa handed us herself, without realizing it. In the days following my visit, Vanessa continued texting my mother, apparently unaware, or not caring, that these messages were being saved. One text, sent about a week after my visit, read, "Your parents need to understand this isn't a charity. We have expenses too, and it's time they contributed like everyone else in this family." Another, sent a few days later, when my mother tried to explain she was consulting a lawyer. "If you lawyer up over a family conversation about fairness, don't expect us to keep making this easy for you." Patricia said that second text, in particular, was almost a threat in writing, "Don't expect us to keep making this easy for you," implied consequences tied directly to my mother seeking legal counsel, which read very differently, coming from someone who legally controlled the deed to her elderly, cognitively declining in-laws' home. While the legal case was being built, I couldn't in good conscience leave my parents in that house, under that pressure, waiting for the next ultimatum. I drove back down 2 weeks later with a rental truck and moved as much of their essential belongings as I could fit, and my parents came to stay with me in Cincinnati. This was honestly one of the hardest parts of the whole ordeal, harder in some ways than the legal battle itself. My father struggled with the change in environment people with cognitive impairment often do best with familiar surroundings, familiar routines, and uprooting him to a new city, a new house, new sounds and smells, set him back for a few weeks. He had more confused moments, more anxious mornings where he didn't recognize where he was. My mother carried a guilt about this that I don't think she's fully let go of. Even now, the guilt of feeling like leaving that house even under threat had cost my father some ground he might not get back. But we also had good moments. My father slowly adjusted. He liked my back porch, said the birds reminded him of the ones back home. My mother started cooking again, something she'd stopped doing much of in the tense months before we moved, and the smell of her cooking in my kitchen felt like a small victory every single time. During this period, Danny called me exactly twice. The first call, about 3 weeks after I moved our parents out, he asked me to stop being so dramatic and said Vanessa never meant it like that. I told him I had the text messages and the paperwork and asked him to explain, specifically, how a document requesting the transfer of $340,000 under threat of losing housing could be interpreted any other way. He didn't have an answer. The second call, about 2 months later, he told me our mother was poisoning me against him and that I was destroying the family by involving lawyers. I told him the family had already been destroyed, at a kitchen table, by his wife, while he stood next to her and said nothing. He hung up on me. We didn't speak again for the rest of the case. Patricia's investigation into the case took nearly 8 months from start to finish. And if I'm honest, there were stretches where I doubted whether we were doing the right thing, whether the stress of litigation on my aging parents outweighed whatever justice we might get at the end. But then, about 5 months in, during the discovery phase, Patricia's team uncovered something that reframed the entire situation. Danny and Vanessa were $60,000 behind on the mortgage of their own house, a separate property they'd purchased 2 years earlier, around the same time as the deed transfer of my parents' home. Danny's mortgage brokerage business, the second one he'd started after the insurance failure, had been struggling for over a year. They had 2 car loans in default. Vanessa had maxed out 3 credit cards. Suddenly, The ultimatum at the kitchen table made a horrifying kind of sense. This wasn't about fairness. This wasn't about my parents pulling their weight. My brother and his wife were drowning financially, and they had looked at two elderly, cognitively vulnerable people who trusted them completely, and decided that the fastest way to bail themselves out was to extract $340,000 from the very people who had already given them a wedding, a business loan, and unconditional love for their entire lives. I remember sitting in Patricia's office when she told me this, feeling something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but was some combination of both. Because part of me had held out hope, even through everything, that there was some misunderstanding, some version of events where my brother wasn't complicit in something this calculated. This discovery ended that hope for good. The case was ultimately resolved through a combination of civil litigation regarding the property transfer and a formal report to Ohio's Adult Protective Services regarding the attempted coercion of the retirement funds. On the property matter, the court found that the transfer of the house from my parents to Danny had occurred under circumstances suggesting undue influence, citing the documented trajectory of my father's cognitive decline beginning before the transfer, the lack of independent legal counsel for my parents at the time of signing, and the absence of any written protections for their continued residency, combined with the subsequent behavior of the beneficiaries, namely the ultimatum regarding the retirement funds, which the court noted was consistent with a pattern of financial exploitation rather than an isolated incident. The court ordered the property returned to my parents' names. Danny's attorney, in his closing arguments, actually argued that my father had understood exactly what he was signing at the time of the original transfer, a statement that, given everything we now knew about my father's cognitive state and the family's financial desperation, felt almost grotesque in its dishonesty. The judge did not find this argument persuasive. On the matter of the attempted coercion regarding the retirement savings, Adult Protective Services opened a formal investigation. Ultimately, criminal charges were not pursued. Proving intent to a criminal standard is difficult, especially when no money actually changed hands, but the investigation and its findings became part of a permanent record, one that would surface in any future background check or licensing review, particularly relevant given Vanessa's work at the time in a role requiring state licensing. My mother asked me, after the ruling came down, whether she should feel guilty for what happened to Danny and Vanessa as a result. I told her no. I told her the consequences they were facing were the direct result of their own choices, made with full awareness of what they were doing, against two people who had never once given them a reason to be treated that way. Danny and Vanessa's marriage did not survive the fallout. About 11 months after the ruling, Vanessa left him. According to a mutual friend who still speaks to Danny occasionally, she blamed him for not fighting harder to keep the money, for being too soft during the legal proceedings, for letting his family win. I found a strange, bitter kind of irony in that the same woman who had orchestrated an ultimatum against two elderly people, framing herself the entire time as someone simply seeking fairness, ultimately left my brother because he hadn't been ruthless enough on her behalf. Danny lost the house he thought he'd inherited early. He lost the retirement funds he never actually got his hands on. And he lost his parents. In the way that matters most, my mother has not spoken to him since the day in court, when his lawyer stood up and argued that a man with documented dementia had fully understood a complex financial transaction designed to benefit everyone except him. That sentence, more than anything Vanessa said at the kitchen table, is the one my mother cannot forgive. I've asked myself many times whether Danny will ever apologize, whether there's a version of this story where the two of us rebuild some kind of relationship. I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that people show you who they are in moments of pressure, and my brother, given the choice between protecting his aging, memory-impaired parents and staying comfortable in his marriage, chose comfort. That's not a small thing. That's not something you get to walk back with a single apology, if an apology ever comes at all. My parents moved back into their house 4 months ago. It's technically back in their name now, fully and legally, no ambiguity left to exploit. But I didn't stop there. I had a simple legal document drawn up. Nothing complicated. Just a few pages granting my parents an irrevocable right to remain in that house for the rest of their lives, regardless of whose name might ever end up on the deed in the future. I did this because I never again want a piece of paper, or the absence of one, to be the reason someone can threaten my parents out of their own home. My father has good days and bad days, same as always. Some mornings he wakes up and knows exactly where he is, cracks a joke about the birds on the back porch, asks about my work like he used to. Other mornings are harder, but he's home, in the house he built a shed in with his own hands, and nobody is going to make him buy it back from anyone ever again. My mother asked me last week, out of nowhere, while we were doing dishes together, whether I thought Danny would ever come around, ever apologize, ever try to make things right. I told her I didn't know. What I told her instead was this: the people who are supposed to protect you sometimes show you, in a single moment, at a kitchen table, exactly who they really are underneath everything you believed about them. And once you've seen that, clearly really seen it, not excused it, not explained it away, you stop waiting for them to turn back into someone they never actually were in the first place. My mother nodded, dried the plate in her hands, and put it away in the cabinet where it's always belonged. In the house, where it's always belonged. That was enough of an answer for both of us. But this story doesn't end there, because there are pieces of it I haven't told you yet, the pieces that happened in between, the ones that showed me just how deep this went, and just how close we came to losing everything, before we ever got the chance to fight for it. I need to go back about 4 months before the ultimatum, to a family dinner that, at the time, seemed completely unremarkable. I only understood its significance later, once the full picture came together. It was my mother's birthday. We were all at Danny and Vanessa's house, a 2-story colonial about 20 minutes from my parents' place. The same house Danny had bought with Vanessa 3 years prior. I remember thinking, at the time, that the house looked a little tired. The landscaping that had been immaculate the first time I visited had gone patchy. There was a for sale sign in a neighbor's yard that Vanessa mentioned, almost too casually, saying the neighborhood wasn't what it used to be, and that some people just can't keep up with their bills anymore. I didn't think anything of the comment at the time. Looking back now, I think she was talking about herself without realizing it. The way people sometimes project their own fears onto the world around them. At dinner, Vanessa brought up the subject of long-term planning for my parents. She framed it that night as pure concern. She talked about assisted living costs, about how expensive memory care facilities were becoming, about how important it was for families to plan ahead financially before a crisis hit. My mother, always trusting, thanked her for thinking about it. My father nodded along, not fully tracking the conversation, the way he sometimes didn't on his harder days. I remember feeling a small flicker of unease that night, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. Something about the specificity of the numbers Vanessa quoted. She seemed to know exactly how much memory care facilities cost in our area, down to the dollar, in a way that felt less like general concern and more like someone who had already done the math on a particular outcome. I know now what she was doing. She was laying groundwork, planting the idea, months in advance, that my parents' money would eventually need to go somewhere, so that when she made her move, it wouldn't come completely out of nowhere. It would feel, to my parents, like the natural continuation of a conversation they'd already had. That's the thing about people like Vanessa. They don't just ambush you. They condition you first. One of the hardest parts of this entire ordeal, for me, wasn't confronting Vanessa, or even discovering my brother's complicity. It was understanding why my mother hadn't told me sooner that things had been building for months. When I finally asked her directly during one of our long talks in my kitchen in Cincinnati, months after they'd moved in with me, she admitted that Vanessa's comments had been escalating for almost a year before the kitchen table ultimatum. Small digs about contribution, passive-aggressive remarks about how some people get to retire early and live for free, while others work themselves into the ground. A comment, once, about how it must be nice not having a mortgage, that made my mother feel obscurely guilty for owning a home outright, as though decades of hard work and careful saving were something to apologize for. I asked her why she never told me. She looked down at her hands for a long moment before answering. "Because I didn't want you to hate your brother," she said. I kept thinking, if I just handled it myself, quietly, it would go away. I didn't want to be the reason the two of you stopped speaking. That admission broke my heart in a way the ultimatum itself hadn't. My mother had spent nearly a year absorbing quiet cruelty, alone, specifically to protect a relationship between her two sons, a relationship that, in the end, Danny himself destroyed through his own inaction. She had taken on the emotional burden of Vanessa's manipulation, as though it were her job to shield the rest of the family from the truth. I told her something that night that I still believe completely. Protecting people from the truth about someone who is hurting you doesn't protect the family. It just isolates you within it. I mentioned Patricia Osei, the elder law attorney, but I want to go into more detail about a conversation we had early in the case, because it reframed how I understood everything that had happened. Patricia told me that in her 15 years of practice, she had seen this exact pattern more times than she could count, and that it almost always followed a similar arc. First, there's a legitimate-sounding justification for transferring an asset, protecting it from lawsuits, avoiding probate, minimizing taxes. Then, once the transfer is complete, the dynamic in the family quietly shifts. The person who now legally controls the asset begins, gradually, to treat the original owners less like family members with an unwritten agreement, and more like tenants, whose continued presence is a favor, one that can be revoked or renegotiated at will. The scariest part, she told me, is that in the vast majority of these cases, the aging parents never tell anyone. They're embarrassed. They feel like admitting their own child is exploiting them, is an admission that they failed as parents somehow, that they raised someone capable of this. So they stay quiet and they comply, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to give. She told me I was lucky, in a strange way, that Vanessa had been aggressive and impatient enough to escalate to an outright ultimatum, rather than the slow, patient drain that Patricia usually saw in these cases. The kind that takes years and leaves almost no paper trail. Vanessa's impatience, born out of her and Danny's genuine financial desperation, was what gave us something concrete to fight. If she'd been smarter, Patricia said, if she'd taken it slow, asked for smaller amounts over a longer period, framed everything as temporary loans instead of one large demand, you might never have known how bad it had gotten until there was nothing left. That conversation stuck with me for weeks. I started to understand that we hadn't just been fighting one ultimatum. We'd interrupted the early stage of something that could have gone on for years, quietly hollowing out my parents' entire financial security, dollar by dollar, disguised as family loyalty. I want to describe one specific day during the legal proceedings, because it's the day I think I finally, completely let go of any hope of reconciling with my brother in the near future. Danny was deposed about 5 months into the case. I wasn't in the room, only the attorneys and a court reporter were present, but Patricia walked me through the transcript afterward, and I've read it more times than I probably should have. When asked directly whether he was aware of the ultimatum his wife delivered to his parents, Danny answered, "I was present for the conversation." When asked whether he believed the conversation constituted a threat, he answered, "I don't think anyone used the word threat." When asked whether he understood, at the time, that his father had documented cognitive decline that might affect his ability to fully process a complex financial demand, Danny answered, "I knew he'd been having some memory issues, yes." When asked why, knowing this, he didn't intervene when his wife pressured his cognitively impaired father to sign over $340,000, Danny said nothing for 11 seconds. The court reporter actually noted the pause in the transcript before answering, "I trusted my wife's judgment." I read that line more times than any other part of the entire case file. I trusted my wife's judgment, not, "I made a mistake," not, "I should have protected my parents." Just a quiet, passive deflection of responsibility onto someone else, even in a sworn deposition, even with the full weight of what had happened laid out in front of him. Patricia told me, gently, that in her experience, people rarely have a dramatic villain moment of self-awareness in depositions. Most people, even when confronted with clear evidence of their own complicity, find ways to minimize their role, to frame themselves as passive bystanders rather than active participants. "He's not going to have an epiphany on the stand," she told me. "If he's ever going to have one, it'll happen much later, alone, probably years from now, if it happens at all. There's a moment I haven't shared yet, one that happened during a good stretch of days for my father, about 6 months into everything, while my parents were still staying with me. We were sitting on the back porch one evening, just the two of us, watching the birds he liked so much. He was having a clear day, sharp, present, more like the father I grew up with than the man who sometimes struggled to remember what year it was. He asked me, out of nowhere, "Do you think I was a bad father to Danny? Different than I was with you?" The question caught me off guard. I asked him why he was asking. "I keep trying to understand," he said, "how he could stand there and let that happen. I keep thinking maybe I did something different with him. Wasn't as hard on him. Maybe I made him soft in a way that made it easy for someone like her to talk him into things." I told my father the truth, as gently as I could. I told him that Danny's choices were Danny's own, made as a grown man in his 30s, and that nothing about how he was raised obligated him to stand silently while his wife threatened his parents. I told him that plenty of people raised exactly the same way, in exactly the same house, by exactly the same parents, would have stood up that day and said, "No, this isn't happening, not to my mother and father." He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said something I think about often. "I used to think the scariest thing about losing my memory was forgetting the people I love. Now I think the scariest thing is realizing some of them were never really looking out for me to begin with. I didn't have anything to say to that. I just sat with him, and we watched the birds until it got dark. The final hearing, where the judge issued her ruling, took place on a Thursday morning in March. My parents came with me, along with Patricia. Danny and Vanessa were there with their attorney, sitting on the opposite side of the courtroom, not looking in our direction even once during the proceedings. The judge's ruling took nearly 20 minutes to read in full, walking through the legal reasoning point by point, the timeline of my father's documented cognitive decline, the absence of independent counsel at the time of the original transfer, the subsequent pattern of behavior demonstrated by the retirement fund ultimatum, and the text messages that had, in the judge's words, demonstrated an intent to leverage housing security against elderly individuals with diminished capacity for financial gain. I watched my mother's face throughout the reading. She didn't cry. She sat perfectly still, holding my father's hand. And when the judge finally said the words ordering the property returned to my parents' names, she let out a breath I don't think she realized she'd been holding for 8 months. Outside the courthouse, Danny approached us the only time he tried to speak to any of us directly during the entire process. He said, "Mom, I never meant for it to go this far." My mother looked at him for a long moment. I don't think I will ever forget what she said next. Delivered without anger, without raising her voice, in the same calm tone she'd used to tell me bedtime stories as a child. "You didn't have to mean for it to go this far," she said. "You just had to stand there and let it happen. And you did." She turned and walked to the car. My father followed her, giving Danny one final look, not angry, just tired. The look of a man who had built something with his own hands, only to watch someone he loved try to take it away, before he got in the passenger seat and closed the door. Danny didn't try to speak to any of us again after that. People ask me sometimes, now that the case is fully resolved, whether I regret how far I took things, whether a quieter resolution, some private family agreement, might have preserved more of the relationship between Danny and our parents. I don't regret it, not for a single day. I've learned that families like to believe blood is an automatic guarantee of loyalty, that being related to someone means they will always, ultimately, protect you. But loyalty isn't automatic. It's demonstrated in the choices people make when it costs them something to make the right one. My brother had a choice, standing in that kitchen, and he chose the person sitting next to him over the 2 people who raised him. I've also learned that elderly parents, especially those beginning to experience cognitive decline, are far more vulnerable to this kind of exploitation than most families want to admit. It doesn't take a stranger, a scam caller, or a predatory contractor to take advantage of an aging parent. Sometimes it's someone who sits at their table every Sunday, who remembers their birthday, who calls them mom and dad and means it, right up until the moment their own financial desperation outweighs whatever affection they claim to have. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this story to take away, it's this. If something in a family situation feels off, even slightly, even in a way you can't fully articulate, trust that feeling. My mother felt that Vanessa's comments were building towards something for almost a year before the ultimatum happened, and she stayed quiet because she didn't want to be the one who caused a rift. The rift happened anyway. It was always going to happen. The only difference silence made was in how much damage was done before anyone stepped in to stop it. It's been just over a year now since that phone call at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. My parents are settled back into their house. My father had a difficult stretch over the winter, but he's stable now. And some mornings he's as sharp as he's ever been, cracking jokes at the breakfast table like nothing ever happened. My mother started a small garden in the backyard this spring, near the shed my father built decades ago. She told me, planting the first row of tomatoes, that it felt important to put something new and growing into that soil, something that belonged entirely to them, with no strings attached, no ultimatums hiding underneath it. I still don't know if Danny and I will ever repair our relationship. I've made peace with the possibility that we might not. What I know for certain is that I would make every single decision the same way again, without hesitation, because the alternative, staying quiet, letting fairness be redefined by whoever was willing to threaten the people I love the most, was never something I could have lived with. My parents are home. Nobody is ever going to make them buy that home back again. Danny told me that about 4 months after the divorce was finalized, he'd been contacted by a former colleague of Vanessa's, a woman who used to work with her at the insurance company where they'd first met. This woman reached out to warn him, apparently out of some sense of guilt or obligation, that Vanessa was doing something similar to her new boyfriend's elderly mother, pressuring the older woman, who lived alone and had recently been widowed, into consolidating her finances into a joint account for simplicity, using almost identical language to what she'd used with our parents. Danny said he didn't know what to do with that information at first. Then he decided to do something I genuinely didn't see coming. He reached out to the new boyfriend directly, a man he'd never met, and told him everything. The ultimatum, the court case, the pattern. He forwarded the man some of the old text messages Vanessa had sent our mother, the ones that had been part of the court record and were technically public documents by that point. I don't know if he believed me at first, Danny said, but he thanked me a few weeks later, said he'd started asking his mom more questions, and some of what she told him lined up exactly with what I'd sent him. He said he was getting his mom set up with her own lawyer, just to be safe. I sat there holding the phone, genuinely stunned. Not because I thought Danny incapable of decency, I'd never actually thought that, not really. Even at my angriest, but because this was the first time in the entire ordeal that he had actively done something to protect someone vulnerable from the exact pattern he'd once stood silently beside. Why'd you do that? I asked him. Reach out to a total stranger? He was quiet for a moment. Because I keep thinking about Dad's face, he said. The day you moved them out. I wasn't there, but Mom told me about it later, about how he looked at the house before he got in the car. And I keep thinking, if I'd said something that day at the kitchen table, just one sentence, just, this isn't right, none of it would have happened. I couldn't stop what already happened to our parents, but I could stop it from happening to someone else's. I want to be honest about something. Hearing all of this didn't erase 18 months of silence, or the deposition transcript, or the image of my mother crying at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. It didn't undo the fact that he stood in that kitchen and let it happen. But I also believe that people are allowed to change, if the change is real, demonstrated through action, rather than just words on a phone call. And reaching out to a stranger to protect his elderly mother from the same pattern that hurt our own parents. That was action, not just an apology. I told Danny I appreciated the call. I told him I wasn't ready to say everything was fixed. That trust isn't something you get back just because you've had a hard 18 months and started seeing a therapist. I told him that if he wanted any kind of relationship with me, or eventually with Mom and Dad, it would have to be built slowly, through consistency, not through one emotional phone call on a Sunday night. He said he understood. He said he wasn't expecting forgiveness, just wanted me to know where he was at. Before we hung up, he asked one more question. Do you think Mom would ever be willing to hear any of this? Not to forgive me, just to hear it? I told him I didn't know. I told him I would think about it, and that if I decided to tell her, it would be on my terms, in my own words, at a time that made sense for her, not for him. I did eventually tell my mother, about 2 weeks later, over coffee on that same back porch where my father had asked me if he'd raised Danny differently. She listened to the entire thing without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee, even though there was nothing left to stir. I'm glad he stopped that woman from doing it to someone else, she finally said. That matters. That's a real thing he did, not just words. But, I asked, because I could hear one coming. But I built a life in that house for 38 years, she said. And I sat at that table and was told I needed to buy my own home back from my son, while he said nothing. A phone call, even a good one, doesn't undo that. Maybe someday I'll be ready to see him again. I'm not ready now. And I don't think I owe anyone an apology for taking my time. I told her she didn't. I told her that was exactly right. It's been about 3 months since that phone call. Danny and I talk occasionally now, maybe once every few weeks. Careful conversations. Nothing like what we had before everything happened. He hasn't asked to see our parents again, and I think, on some level, he understands that pushing for that right now would undo whatever small trust he's started rebuilding with me. My mother still gardens every weekend. My father had a good stretch through the winter, sharper than he's been in a while. And he started telling stories about his machine shop days again, the way he used to before all of this happened, before the stress of the case seemed to accelerate his harder days. I don't know if this story has a clean ending. Real ones rarely do. What I know is this. My parents are safe, in their home, with legal protections in place that no ultimatum can undo. My brother is, slowly, in his own way, trying to become someone different than the man who stood silent in that kitchen. Whether that's enough, whether it will ever be enough, isn't something I can answer yet. But I've stopped needing a clean ending to feel like the fight was worth it. It was worth it the moment my parents walked back through their own front door, knowing nobody could ever tell them to buy it back again.